Hello and welcome to our discussion on the Indian economy 1950 to 1990. This is the third subtopic. Let me remind you the first topic was on the goals of Indian economic planning, the second topic on agriculture, where we look at land reforms and green revolution. Today, we'll talk about Indian industries. And here you'll learn about the role of public sector, government owned sector industries towards industrial development of the country. Then we'll look at the need to regulate private sector under the Industrial Policy Resolution 1956. At the same time, we'll look at the features of this policy. And lastly, we'll look at the definition and importance of small scale industries. Let's base our discussion from the textbook. First thing is, why do we need the role of government towards industrial development? We understand that immediately after independence, our country was poor. We can only progress only if we have good industrial base, because industries can provide more employment, stable employment than agriculture, and at the same time it can brings about modernization and overall prosperity. So that's why the planners during that time, they felt the need to incorporate all these goals of industrial development in our 5 years 5-year plans. And if you look back before independence, there were two well-known managed iron and steel big industries. One is Tata Jamshedpur, the other is at Kolkata. That's why we need more than this after independence. So the problem was, if we simply depend on these private individuals, they did not have enough capital to undertake industrial development on a large scale. So at the same time, the market was not that big enough. People were poor. There was not much more to sell towards our own market. So that's why to undertake major projects, even if they have the capital, it's difficult for these private industrialists. So it is principally for these reasons that the government had to play an important role, leading from the front, to start and own industries to promote at the same time the industrial sector of the economy. That's the first thing. Why do we adopt public sector in industrial um, development? Okay, so the state would have to complete control over those industries which are vital for economy, like basic industries, iron, steel, cement, and so on. Government has to take the front in setting up those industries. And also there was an encouragement for private industries, but the policies of private sector would have to be complementary, work together with the government-owned industries. So that's why immediately after independence, we had the Industry Policy Resolution first 1948, and after 8 years, which is at the same time completing the first 5-year plan, India started this Industry Policy Resolution 1956. This is a very important policy for industrial development. For development of any sector, we need policy. So this is the policy for industries. Okay. So what is this policy? In accordance with the goals of the state controlling the commanding heights of the economy, this policy, IPR in short we called, it was adopted in 1956. And it was at the same time that we started the second 5-year plan. And this second 5-year plan was to push forward the industrial development, which although we had from the first year the socialist pattern of society. So what the question now arises, what are the features of industry policy resolution of this 1956? In short, to remember, the first thing is, in this new industry policy resolution, they bring about the the classification of industries into three sectors, three categories. Remember that. There are many industries, but all these industries are clubbed together in three groups. Okay, so that is the first feature. The second feature, which I will talk about later, but let us list at the moment, is the importance of small scale industries. So these are the two main features of IPR 1956. Group industries into three categories and stress the need on the development of small scales. We'll see why. Okay, so let's go to the first feature. This policy classified industries into three categories. So what are those three categories? The first comprised industries which would be exclusively owned by the state. Only the government have exclusive ownership on these industries. No other can set up industries in this category, first category. Second category consisted of industries in which the private sector could supplement the efforts of the state sector, with the state taking the sole responsibility for starting the new units. So in the second group, there are those industries which you can have private industries, private owned, but they have to complement and supplement the government owned public sector. But to set up a new unit in this group, only the government is entitled to. That means no private industrialist can set up industries falling under the second category. So the first and the second more or less owned by the government. In the second, there are some private, which are existing but not new ones. But the third category consisted of all the other remaining industries that were not in that first two. And these industries were allowed for private industrialists to set up. So all the industries in the third group are owned by the private sector. That's why you have three groups. All industries are here. You can see some owned by the government, some owned by the private. That's why we have a mixed economy. Okay, so let's see why this private sector. The question arises: why and how was private sector regulated under this IPR 1956? Why do we have to control? Why the government has to control this private sector? We understand the reason why why the planners thought the need for government industries to take the lead, even though we have private sector. And in this policy is clearly specified that we need to control private sector. Although we need them, we have to control them. Okay, so the way to control the private sector, first thing was a system of licensing system. So during those years, 1948 onwards, India adopted a license Raj policy. That means if you were to set up industries, even though it falls under the third group, exclusively belong to the private sector, they need a license or permission to set up a new industries. Why do we need this kind of restriction? Let's see about that. And this policy clearly stated that no new industry was allowed unless a license was obtained from the government. That means you have to um, apply for a permit to get a license to start even in the third group. Why this is so? Why there is restriction? Why there is this kind of policy? This policy was used to promote for promoting industry in backward areas, backward regions. India is a vast country. Regions have industries, others they are deprived industries. The government needs to decentralize the industry. It wants industries to spread all over the country, especially in backward regions. That's why, unless you obtain a license promoting, so to say, promising to promote industries in backward areas, set up industries in backward areas, you won't get a license. So it was easier to obtain a license if industrial unit was established in economically backward area. That means if you are the industrialists, you have the capital, you want to set up industries, you have to wait for permission. But if you were to set up in rural areas, you'll get a permission easier and quicker than if you were to set up in urban areas. So that is the first intention why government regulated, controlled over private sector, is to encourage them to set up industries in backward areas. Secondly, it in addition, such unit, if you set up in rural areas, they were given concessions such as tax benefits and electricity at lower tariff. So that is the assistance you get from the government. Not only you get license quicker, but you will also get other benefit like concession, uh, less cost of raw materials, less tax, and electricity at lower tariff. So that's why you'll get more benefit, and the country will also develop industries in rural areas. So this whole thing is called the policy on regional equality. It wants to bring regions comparably at par, on equal level. No? East must equal to west, not to south, and so on. That's why you need regulation on private industries. And secondly, what way it controlled through licenses? The other way is to control um, by the requirement of having a license, getting a license for expanding output. Suppose you have an industry that you have set up because you got the license, but in that application you have already stated that you want to say produce 10 quintals per day. But if you want to produce 20 quintals per day, you want to expand the output, you have to have a license again. Or you need a license for diversifying production. You want to produce from, for example, initially you produce soap, because you've got a license on that, but now you want to produce medicine, you need again a license for diversifying product. Okay, this was meant to ensure that the quantity of goods produced was not more than what the economy required. The government wants to know what these private units are producing, in what quantity, so that these resources that are scarce, especially after independence, can be utilized effectively towards the needs of the people, not more. Okay, so that's why we need a license for the government to monitor. License to expand production was given only if the government was convinced that the economy required a larger quantity of goods. Unless and until the government satisfied that there is really a demand in the market towards the need to increase the goods, it would not, say, allow private sector to increase more. It wouldn't give that license as they ask for. So these are the discussion on why the government regulated private sector. You understand why? No? Because it wants to see that the goods that they produce is what the economy needs. Okay, and lastly, when you talk about industries, we talk about industries that are large, because these are the backbones towards the development of the economy. Okay, but Industry Policy Resolution 1956 not only stressed towards the need to have more big industries, but also seeing the importance of small scale industries. That's why it gives important place for small scale in this policy and policies afterwards. So let's talk about small scale now. Let's first define what is a small scale. A small scale industry is defined with reference to the maximum investment allowed on the assets of a unit. How much is the capital that are invested, that defines an industry. But this limit on how much you invest changes from time to time. In 1950, that threshold was set at 5 lakhs, but at present, the maximum investment allowed in small scale is 1 crore rupees. That means if you cross 1 crore rupees of your amount that the amount that you have invested, it's no more a small scale. Okay, so small scale is defined as that kind of industries which the amount of investment is equal to or less than 1 crore. So why the government give importance to small scale? There must be a reason. Okay, so that is another point to look at the importance of small scale from especially India's perspective, where we all know India has a large population and people are unemployed. So let's look at that reason. It is believed that small scale industries are more labor intensive. What do you mean by labor intensive? Labor intensive use more labor than large scale industries and therefore generate more employment. So if you encourage small scale, you will employ more people. It's set up by private individuals, small individuals. You require a small amount of money, means common man can set up industries. They can employ people. So there is a scope of large scale employment, especially for India having large population and unemployment. So that's why government felt the need to encourage small scale because of its labor intensive character. Okay, but the thing is, we know small has a problem. These industries, being small, cannot compete with the big industrial firms. So it is obvious that development of small scale requires them to be shielded from the large scale. So the government has to see that if you develop small scale, leave them on their own, they will fail. They'll have to close down because of the laws. They cannot compete with the big um, players. It's not it. So that's why to develop small scale, they need protection. They need shield, protect from the competition of the large scale. For this purpose, so how the government goes about in protecting them. For this purpose, the production of a number of products was reserved from the small scale industries. That's why to protect them, they reserve the product. Suppose now product that should be produced by the small scale are listed. For example, just an example, it can be paper, it can be soap, it can be anything. So once you give these list of items to be produced by the small scale, large scale cannot produce anymore. Because if large scale also produce, small scale also produce, in the market, people would buy product from large scale. So small scale would suffer. So that's why once small scale produce product, they will reserve. Large scale cannot produce anymore. So that is the system of reservation to protect small scale. Okay, and at the same time, the small scale, you understand, small, they are weak. They were also given concessions, such as what are those concessions? Lower excise duty, the tax. They were charged less, or even at times no tax. And bank loans at lower rate of interest. If you borrow money to set up small scale, you will get cheap loan, lower rate of interest than if you compare if you were to set up large scale and borrow money. Okay, so that's the importance of small scale. Okay, so now we talk about this important sector of industry because we understand if you want to develop a country, you need to develop industries. Industrialization, no, is um, like a key, no, towards development of the country. So that's about what we talk about in this session. So what you've learned? You learn about the reason why public sector we given a leading role in industrial development during the planning period. Now we understand private sector have less capital. Even if they have capital, market it's less. Not it. So that's why we need government. It's number two, why and how private sector regulated under IPR. We understand why. We understand how. What are the procedures, the steps taken by the government. And we need to also list down and explain, if you can, the features of Industry Policy Resolution 1956, especially the classification of industries into three groups. That's the first and the main feature. And we can now define small scale industries and also understand the importance of small scale industries with respect to employment potential. If you look at the situation in India where we have population and unemployment problem, so we need small scale. So that's the thing we learned today.